Welcome back, guys. So I talked a lot about reserve list cards and old school vintage cards and teased some commander cards or cards I would put into my commander decks. I do enjoy unique commanders, which Tymna isn't by herself, neither is Tana, but you'll see I found a very interesting deck idea resolving around lands and lands matters. So these are the two commanders. Neither of them are important to my deck idea. Tymna is mostly there to draw me cards and I guess gaining me some life, even though she gets removed quite often. The politics in Commander allow me to draw cards very often and steadily filling up my hand, while Tana often stays in the command zone doing mostly nothing, but sometimes I put her out, deal some damage, get her even bigger sometimes, and actually creating some saplings, which are not unimportant, but it's not the main idea to get a lot of tokens. The main idea is lands. And the YouTube channel EDH Deck Building had this idea about these two cards. This is the inspiration for the deck. Land tags allows you to search for up to 3 lands in your upkeep when one of your opponents has more lands than you, basic lands, and you fetch them. I have I think 16 basic lands. I'm allowed to play everything except for blue. And Seismic Assault allows me to throw those cards in opponents' faces or any target that looks threatening. So let's go deeper. The next couple of cards resolve around discarding. So these, and I think a couple more, resolve around discarding lands. So I teased about this card being very similar to Seismic Assault in another video. Not many people know about this card, Land's Edge, which gives everyone the ability to throw lands in people's faces. No one will use this ability except for you. So if Seismic Assault gets destroyed, you still have this one, which does the same but only to players. And everyone can do it, but no player will have too many lands except for you in your hand. So the idea of fetching lands a lot into your hand and discarding them allows for these cards to be played. I have some German cards in here. I will put the English translation or the original card on the screen so you can read along. I do not have the shark partner for Brawlin in here, but whenever I discard a card, Brawlin gets 1+1/+1 counter and deals 1 damage to every opponent, which means more damage for my opponents if I discard lands, which I want to do. And the second effect is not relevant. The Badger Saw gives me some utility to discarding cards. Most of the time I will create treasures, but maybe sometimes I will discard different creatures or non-creature cards and non-land cards, which allows for different effects of the Badger Saw, but mostly for some treasure generation. Lord Windgrace is one of the stronger cards in here. Most of you might already know him. He costs 5 and enters the battlefield with 5 loyalty counters, and the first 2 are very important effects in this deck. The +2 is discarding a card and drawing a card, and drawing an additional card if I discarded a land, which I should be able to do if I have a lot of lands. The second ability being -3, putting 2 lands into the onto the battlefield from my graveyard. Another one who is similar to the Seismic Assault and the Land's Edge is Borogmus, who gives the ability of me discarding lands for even more damage to any target. And when he deals combat damage to a player, I reveal the top 3 cards and put all land cards into my hand and the rest into the graveyard. I think I never actually used that effect. I only use him for discarding lands. So I guess the second ability is also kind of nice with him having trample, but normally when he's on the battlefield and my hand is filled with lands, I normally win the game. Another card which also allows me to discard cards is the Eula's Influence. The translation is on the screen, and I am allowed to discard land cards to create 2/2 bear tokens. Normally I do that just before it's my turn in Commander, and I create like, I don't know, 5, 10 2/2 bears, which then are allowed to attack since I created those tokens a turn before. And lastly, the Faith of the Devoted allows me, whenever I discard a card, to pay 1 and draining everyone for 2 life. Next up, if we say lands matters, I have some Landfall cards, which are all these here. The Omnath is quite famous for creating 5/5 elemental tokens whenever I trigger Landfall, and whenever one of the elementals or he dies, I deal 3 damage to any target. Yes, to any target. The Avenger of Zendikar is one of the win cons of this deck. Pretty straightforward. He puts into play 0/1 plant tokens for each land I own in play, and whenever a land enters the battlefield, they all get a +1/+1 counter. The Skewed Swarm may be next. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, I get a 1/1 insect token, and if I have more than 6 land, I create a copy of him. This card actually once let me win the game by creating, I don't know, like 40,000 of Skewed Swarm. That was quite brutal. I escalated a lot, and a Skewed Swarm is a target you should remove when you see him. So, Valakut Exploration, I think it's in English. And whenever a land enters the battlefield, I exile the top card of my deck, and I may play it this turn. And if I don't, I deal damage for each card in exile with this card to each opponent. This card can easily deal 3-4 damage every turn with all the ramp I play and all the extra lands I put into play. Felidar Retreat gives me either a 2/2 cat or a +1/+1 counter on each of my creatures. Fun fact, Tana can grow bigger with this and create even more saplings, so that is quite useful to know and to keep in mind. Also, increasing the power of Tymna is also useful to gaining more life, but I use it for both of the effects actually. So depending on how the board looks, I put a 2/2 cat or increase the power of all my creatures. And lastly, for the landfalls, I get 1 mana of any color whenever a land enters the battlefield. So this is a great ramp card as well. And speaking of ramp, the next couple of cards are dedicated to ramp, so this should be all these cards here. Crop Rotation should be well known. For 1 mana, I sacrifice a land and get another land into play, which could be an Urborg or a Cabal Coffers. I will show you the lands in a sec. Storm Cauldron is actually one of my win conditions in this deck. This is kind of like a stacks piece. No one wants to play anything, or someone has to sacrifice a lot to remove this. and if they can, they are kind of stuck. And I actually don't care to tap out, take all my lands into my hand, and throwing the lands into their faces. So this is such a great card. This one won me a lot of games. And giving everyone the ability to play an extra land, also not that bad, because I gain more from it with all my landfall triggers. This card is bonkers. Playing extra lands is important. I have those 3. Azusa allows me 2 additional lands. Oracle and Wayward Swordtooth allow me 1 additional land each. And Oracle says I can play with the top card of my deck. I can play the top card if it's a land, and I play with it revealed. That's what I want to say. And the Wayward Swordtooth can't attack or block if I don't have 10 or more permanents in play. Right, so for the last 3 ramps, this one is just straightforward natural lore, I think it is in English. Getting 1 forest card, which also fetches dual lands. Very, very good fixing for colors here. And if I play 4 colored, I want to have as much fixing as I can have. Farseek also great for color fixing. This one also fetches a dual land if I wanna. Most of the time it will. And by the way, one comment on this card. Even though it cannot fetch a forest by itself, if I really need a second forest because I have to pay green somehow, if I really want to have a second forest, I can still fetch for a Plains Forest card. So keep that in mind. Lastly, this one I also count towards the ramp category. This one gets +1/+1 for each land in my graveyard. And I can sacrifice a forest or plants and get any land I want. Any special land I want into play. That is very awesome. Then we have several cards that give me lands into my hand back. Now I discard a lot of lands and I want to have them back. So dredging 3, putting maybe lands even into my graveyard with Life from the Loam is great. And getting 3 lands in my hand back with Life from the Loam again, also great, so I can throw them into people's faces. Sprouting Vines, just a great ramp. Putting more land cards into my hand and either playing them or throwing them into people's faces. Has Storm, so I get several lands most of the time. Expedition Map allows me to fetch for any 1 land, any card I want, any land card. Also very useful, not only basic lands, and Sylvan Scrying as well allows me to fetch any land card. Now for the mini cards. The Gitrog monster is very, very strong in this deck. I have to sacrifice at the beginning of map keep 1 land. Whenever 1 or more lands are put into my graveyard from anywhere, that means discarding as well, I draw a card, and I may play a second land each turn, or an additional land. And the Underrealm Lich actually allows me to look for specific cards. Whenever I draw, I get one out of the top 3 cards instead. So I look at the top 3 cards whenever I draw, and I get 1 of those cards, and the rest goes into the graveyard, which is also great, so I can recur them if I wanna. And for 4 life points, he can even be indestructible. Those 2 go greatly hand in hand. I won with those together on the board. He draws me cards and he digs through my deck, and they are just like so synergetic. By the way, sacrificing lands is also a part of the deck. I will dig deeper into that as well. Titania gives me a land out of my graveyard onto the battlefield, and whenever a land is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, I get a 5/3 elemental token, which is also, by the way, great for Omnath, who deals 3 damage when 1 of the elementals from Titania dies. So that's also a nice combo. I don't think I have them both on the board at the same time because they are both kill on sight, but yeah, it's kind of fun. And this one, maybe not so many people know. It's on the reserved list. I think it is called, I will put it on screen. I forgot how it's called in English. Something natural order, natural selection, but I think those are two different cards. Anyways, oops. So this one says, each player who has 6 or more lands sacrifices all the lands he controls until they have 5, and all the players who have 4 or less lands search their libraries for as many lands until they're at 5 lands, and then they shuffle. And this card is actually, on the one hand, a very nice and political one. It puts back people if they're behind on the curve or just not drawing lands. You can put them back into the game. I did that once, which was very nice, and the person was very happy to play a round of Magic actually, and everyone else, I think we put them back from 7 to 5 or something like that, from 7 lands to 5 lands. And that person had like 2 or 3 lands and was just super struggling. But also I will at some point have no lands in play, because for example with Storm Cauldron I can just tap out and get all the lands into my hand, and then there are no lands in hand, in play I mean. And when I have no lands in play, I can use the mana I just put into my mana pool and use it to cast this, and then I have 5 lands again, and everyone else loses their lands and goes down back to 5. I have so many lands in hand, and I put 5 lands back into the game from my library, and I could just tap them again with Storm Cauldron, put them back into my hand, and throw them also at people if I need to do that. So that card is very interesting, and I enjoy playing it a lot. And it's very undervalued, I think, in like these kind of special, unique decks. They really shine. Now we said we discard a lot of cards. Now look at those 3. Praetor's Council is pretty straightforward, just gives you a whole graveyard back into your hand for 8 mana, and you have no maximum hand size, so that's awesome. This card I enjoy playing. All the lands back into my hand. Also this card, if I discard all my lands and throw them into people's faces, I really want them back into my hand, so casting this, instant speed is also great. You can surprise someone so brutally with this card. You're like, I have like 10 lands, I could do 20 damage. Oh well, for 2 mana I can do 40 damage. And that's just crazy. The Bag of Holding is also great. All the cards I discard into this one, and the bag exiles them. For 2 mana I can also draw a card and discard a card, so looting is also very great. And for 4 mana I can sacrifice the bag and get all the lands or cards I discarded into the bag back into my hand, being able to discard again. And lastly, cards, as you realized, cards go into my graveyard and disappear from my graveyard. So Tormod allows me actually to create some zombies, which are tapped. I will come back to that in a second. A way to put them into play untapped. But he is just great to creating some attackers if I need to have some. If I don't have any bears, he creates 2/2 zombies that can attack at some point later in the game. Get boosted by the Landfall, Falidor, Retreat, and other stuff. So, great card. Speaking of putting cards from your graveyard back into your hand or play, Tormod really shines when you play cards from your graveyard, lands from your graveyard. So a land leaves the graveyard and you get a 2/2 zombie. This one does the same. You can play lands from your graveyard, the Remnant Excavator. And then we have like putting cards back into play or into my hand from the graveyard. And I mean like a big amount of lands. Or other permanents that were destroyed, also creatures and enchantments. So the ultimatum says like you get all your cards, all the permanent cards back that have a different name than the others. That means in Commander like pretty much every other permanent, and the only things that double are basic lands, and I have 4 of each type. That means if I have actually have 4 mountain swamps, etc. in my graveyard, I get 1 of each, but that's still a lot with all the other non-basics I play. Creeping Renaissance says for 5 mana I choose a permanent type and return all of them to my hand. That means most of the time lands, and it has flashback for 7. Being able to throw them again. Splendid Reclamation also puts lands into play tapped, all of them from my graveyard, onto the battlefield tapped. So I just discarded a bunch of lands, play this, and have them back on the battlefield tapped. And Scape Shift lets me sacrifice all my lands and put into play the same amount of lands, any lands by the way, and then I can just use them again. They are also tapped, but this one I'm also trying out, and some people said it's not so good, but I disagree. This card did some work the last couple of games when I played those. All of these put the permanents onto the battlefield tapped, and this one just lets them enter untapped. So I can just use my lands again, tap them for mana. The zombies come into play tapped and I can just block. So this one I just want to say, this one I'm still trying out, but I think it's very interesting because there are also some lands that enter the battlefield tapped, and I think there are a couple of more cards where I put this in. Also the lands I fetch with the spells. Very interesting. So, card draw. With Wheel of Fortune, if we're in the discard theme, why not discard our whole hand, giving everyone the opportunity to draw more cards, not only me, but also the opponents, filling up my hand with 7 new cards and possibly lands. The Nullspire Dragon is I think it won me one game. Because it lets me draw cards. It lets me discard my hand when he comes into play, and lets me draw as many cards as I did damage this turn. That means if I threw 10 lands and did 20 damage, put him onto the battlefield, I draw 20 cards and can throw possibly even more lands into the faces of my opponents. So great card. And Cling to Dust is, I think, an undervalued card up to this point. It's from Theros Beyond Death. It lets me exile a card from any graveyard for 1 black mana, and if it was a creature card I gain 3 life, not that important most of the time, but otherwise I draw a card. So it's for 1 black, I draw a card. Instant speed, and it has escape, which is also very important, so if I don't need some of my cards in my graveyard, I can exile 5 cards, pay 4 and draw another card, and maybe even exile some threats from my opponent's graveyards. Now, some removal, which is all that. One card most of you possibly won't know is the Aura Fracture, which is an enchantment for 3 mana, which lets me sacrifice a land and destroy any enchantment. Being able to just sacrifice all my lands and putting them back into play and triggering all the landfall triggers is just amazing. So this card most of the time just stays on board, and everyone is like, it's kind of a weird removal. Why would anyone sacrifice their lands to remove an enchantment? Well, it's great. And in the worst case, you can just target this with your 20 lands or whatever and destroy the Aura Fracture, and then get all your lands back with, I don't know, Splendid Reclamation or whatever, and have 20 landfall triggers again. Path to Exile, pretty self-explanatory. I will put it up on screen if you don't know it. Swords to Plowshares as well. Some staples. Dam, it's not Damnation. Dam for 2 mana destroys a creature, and it has Overload for 4. I can destroy all the creatures. Second removal destroys all creatures, and I draw cards equal to the amount of creatures destroyed. It also has Cycling and does -2/-2 then. And then some artifact and enchantment removal, one with Split Second and the other one just gives 4 life points to my opponent. Now Tutors, I think, and then we have lands, yes. So I have Eternal Witness in the deck, just because I don't know where I should have put it then, where else I should have put it than Tutors, because it just gives me 1 card of my graveyard, and if it's in there, I just take it again and I use it again. And then we have Demonic Tutor, Enlightened Tutor, Idyllic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, and a shiny Academy Rector, which allows me to, when he dies, exile him and put any enchantment from my deck onto the battlefield, which is such a great card because if I don't have my land tax or my Seismic Assault or any enchantment I just want, maybe one of them is dead and I can just get like a Eula's Influence, or you just name it, whatever. This guy gets me where I want to go. Now, lands. I play 3 fetch lands. I think the mana base is not perfect, but I think it is almost perfect. So 3 fetches for the colors that I play. I think I play 5 of the possible 6 shock lands, just because I don't have a Blood Crypt that I can spare for this deck. I think you could cut some of the basic lands and put in 1 more shock land. You could also cut some of the basic lands and put in another fetch land, but I think it works greatly. I also play the OG duels, which all of the 6 have white borders, so I can fetch them faster. I think I don't have any of them double or triple actually, so these are my only existing copies of these. I have 1 set of duels, and I think maybe I have like 2 or 3 times. But out of those, like, this deck has like the OG duels in it, and I just enjoy playing them in here because it's such a unique deck. And it's 4-colored, it needs the fixing. The other decks, if I play 2-colored, I don't need the duels. I play the cycling lands, which all have cycling for 1, so they would enter the battlefield tapped, by the way. The Amulet of Vigor, which I talked about earlier, also works here, so these lands would enter the battlefield untapped if I really needed a mana at some point. And then if I don't need them, I can just cycle them for 1 card. I play Urborg, I play a Cabal Coffers, and a Lake of the Dead, which is another reserve list card, which when it enters the battlefield lets me sacrifice a swamp, or I have to sacrifice this land. And it just gives me a normal black, and I can sacrifice any other swamp and add 4 black to my mana pool, so this just ramps you a lot. And by the way, you can tap the swamp for mana, which you are going to sacrifice into the Lake of Dead, just a side note. So these 2 are also great together, but obviously those 3 are just amazing. I also play a Yavimaya. If they ever print the red and the white version of the Yavimaya Urborg cycle, they would go into this deck as well, obviously. Buyukabok just for great removal of exiling any graveyard. If I sacrifice it and put it back into play from the graveyard, it's just great to remove your opponent's graveyards regularly. And lastly, from my non-basic lands, this Ghost Town is a land which is not known by many people, I think. It just gives me colorless, which is in a 4-color deck not great, but still I have the Urborg and the Yavimaya, which makes it create colored mana. And for 0 mana, I can put it back into my hand during an opponent's turn. So I can have this land on the battlefield and just tap it for mana, whatever it gives me. And for 0 mana at an opponent's turn, I can take it into my hand and throw it into their face. And in my turn, maybe I play it from the graveyard again. So that's a very interesting, unique land card I can just throw in and also throw at opponents' faces. And as I already spoiled, I play 4 plains, which are beautiful Mirage basic lands. I play 4 swamps, beautiful Mirage swamps, as well as 4 mountains, also beautifully from Mirage. Just look at the artwork, it's so beautiful. This waterfall. 4 forests from Mirage. I just enjoy those. They're so beautiful, and I have 1 of each artwork. And it's so many people are like, wow, where are those from? And like these OG original old border basic lands are the lands today to pimp out your deck. So I hope you enjoyed my deck tech on my Tymna and Tana. If you enjoyed that unique deck idea of mine, I probably forgot a couple of combos and cards that synergize with each other. If you found anything that is noteworthy, let me know, and I see you in the next one. Bye bye.